Thanks everyone, excited to be here. Today I'm going to talk about the moonshot that I think Canada needs to take, and that's putting Canadian payloads on Canadian rockets to secure Canada's economic and national security. First of all, by moonshot, I don't actually mean pictures of the moon. When I talked to my family before this, they thought I might be going to an astrophotography conference where I get to talk about my hobby. That is not the case. What I'm referring to, well, fortunately for you, that's not the case. A moonshot is a decade-scale investment that defines a country and is naturally ambitious. Canada is a country that is used to moonshots. Most of us here are here today because at some point they were inspired to do something bigger, to take on a big challenge. And it spanned decades, all the way from Avro-Aero to RadarSat and Canadarm. All of us here have some ambition from those projects. Wyvern's founders were inspired by the Canadian space industry to build a company in Canada. And we decided to do it on hard mode from Edmonton. Who here thinks of Edmonton when they think of space? Yes, we got a few, perfect. So we specifically wanted to not only build a space company, but we wanted to do it at home to benefit all Canadians across the country. From those beginnings in 2017, we've scaled across the country and now have 5 satellites in orbit. When we started in 2017, we had to start with the commercial industry first. That's because at that time, it was impossible to actually get contracts from Canadian government, with the notable exception of DRDC. When you start in Edmonton, you think a lot about farming, because when you're driving Highway 2 all the time, that's all you see. And that's where our first customers came from. It is kind of funny that you always note when somebody starts an EO company, where they're from always determines what the first use cases are. If you're from California, it might be wine. If you're from Edmonton, it might be wheat. We also focused on things like tree species detection and energy and mining. In today's world, we've started to move into defense applications, melding the dual use case that Elliot Pence talked about earlier. He talked about the difficulty of going from the commercial to the defense, but that's what we see happening in Canada today. We're starting to do things like look at the paint signatures on ships and determine them uniquely without looking at their AIS signature. It turns out that ships, when they go from port to port, they could change their AIS beacon, but it's pretty hard to paint your ship in the middle of the sea and change its paint signature fast enough. But this leads us to this conference and this moment in particular. All of our satellites have launched on somebody else's rocket. We've raised $26 million, and over 10 million of that has gone to other countries to launch our satellites. If you take that number, multiply it by the number of satellites that are launched by everybody in this room, in this country, that is a massive number. The imperative to do Canadian launch, to have that money flow to Canadian industry and build Canadian jobs in Canada is an imperative and an urgency that is immediate. Not only is it because of the speed and capability and being front of the queue for Canadian priorities, just the economics of it make a ton of sense. Rahul talked about $100 million to launch Electron. That's just 10 Wyverns, and there are certainly 10 Wyverns out there today and launching in the future. That's why I think the moonshot that Canada must take over the next decade is to put more Canadian payloads on Canadian rockets. This will require coordination from commercial industry like Wyvern, as well as government. We can't do it alone, but we have to do it together. We increasingly run our economy and secure our borders from space. When I was 20, I drove up to the very top of Canada just because that's what you do when you're 20 and you just have maybe silly ideas, and you start to really appreciate how big Canada is. All of our primary industries that have historically driven our economy are based on our natural resources and our vast geography. We've already talked a lot today about the national security imperative, but there is also an economic imperative. Mining, energy, forestry, and agriculture are increasingly using space technology to drive productivity and increase productivity growth. Canadian space technology should be driving this. If you build a company in Canada, you're next door to some of the most innovative natural resource companies in the world, and they want to use your technology and combine it with AI to drive their own economic growth. I'm going to take a slightly different tack on Arctic security and really focus on some of the gaps we have in sovereign space-based intelligence. James talked about this in his talk as well, but we currently, out of all the major modalities, only have 2 sovereign constellations. The other optical modalities are reliant on foreign providers, and ultimately, when push comes to shove, Canada's interests will go to the back of the other country's interests and go to the back of the queue. We've seen this time and time again. We need to fill these gaps. We need to have Canadian payloads with optical, multispectral, and other modes on Canadian rockets that will let us launch when we need to. All of these gaps all end at the exact same place, somebody else's launch pad. Hence, while we're at this conference, why we need to really make this an urgent moonshot. Urgently get Canadian payloads onto some of the rockets that have been described at this conference today. So, what happens if Canadian rockets are available as of today? Companies like Wyvern can start to design payloads specifically for the rockets that will be available in 2028 and beyond. We're missing a slide, but what Wyvern could design is a deployable optics payload. That's one of our special technologies where we're taking a telescope, folding it up, and unfolding it in space. To be frank, it was often difficult before with the advent of things like Starship to make the economic case for launching deployable optics. Both Canadian launch vehicles, we can put 3 of them in one Nord Space Tundra rocket. That means that we can fill those gaps quickly, we can fill them on demand, and deployable optics lets you launch high-performing satellites at a relatively low cost and also have them much smaller. Today's best EO satellites will not fit in most of the first-generation rockets from the various companies here today. It's very important that we have certainty over the launch situation in Canada, so all of the companies here, all of the EO companies, can start to design their payloads for these rockets. There's 2 things I think we need to do to move forward with Canadian payloads on Canadian rockets. One is that we have to make it possible to build here. When Wyvern was 4 people in a basement, we took a look at the RSSA Act, and we recognized it as a significant barrier to building and operating satellites here. It's partly why Wyvern decided to build and operate its satellites not in Canada. That's millions of dollars that go elsewhere because we simply could not design a system that met both the regulatory requirements and our customer requirements. Sometimes curveballs get thrown at us too. Things like the new ISED debris mitigation rules that came out 2 weeks ago, as a whole, provide a significant barrier to launching innovative companies in Canada. The burden of these regulations fall on small startups and academic programs which are not equipped and are not able to deal with these regulatory barriers and will move elsewhere. Second, it has to be more than just D&D and DRDC leading these initiatives. NRCan, ECCC, and AFC all use satellite technology today. Wyvern has been able to work with people from DRDC since the beginning, but it is very difficult to work with other departments that may use satellite data. For example, AFC's inventory program for crops runs on satellite data. Let's make that Canadian. Let's identify what we need 5 years in the future and put up the opportunity for Canadian companies to bid on those contracts and only get paid if they actually execute. So I did put some astrophotography in here, but it's not mine. This is the Artemis II picture of the moon and Earth. I think it's one of my favorite pictures, and I have it everywhere now because it really just goes to show you can decide to do things. You can decide today to launch a rocket company, you can decide to launch an EO company, and it's the best time in Canada ever to do so. So one of my calls to action is that we should do more of that. We should identify those Canadian problems that exist in industry and defense today and solve them. It is the time to do it. A new generation, many of them here, are ready to lead. They're ready to bring their capabilities, which already exist in the Canadian market and the commercial market, to government, D&D, as well as some of the other entities I mentioned earlier. It's time to scale these companies. A lot of them sit at the 40 to 60 person range in the single digit to tens of millions of dollars range, but we need those to become public companies. We need to grow companies to $100, $200, $300 million in revenue, such that we can have new version of champions in today's market. I'm here to say, let's go build the country we intend to be. Let's put Canadian payloads on Canadian rockets to solve Canadian problems.